In the frontier days of the American West, the Chuck Wagon was a mobile kitchen. In my Agile Chuck Wagon, I have the Agile, the Lean, the leadership, the programming techniques you need to bring your bland software implementation to life. You bring the project, I'll bring the fire. Let's get cooking. This free episode of the Agile Chuck Wagon is provided by the subscribers to the Agile Chuck Wagon. If you would like to become a subscriber, find out about premium content and early access, please visit us at patreon.com/AgileChuckWagon. That's patreon.com/AgileChuckWagon. And now back to the show. Hello, today on the Agile Chuck Wagon, we're continuing our series about tricky topics for Agile coaches to teach. This series came about because of a LinkedIn conversation with Jeff Davis, who found me through the Badass Agile podcast. I recommend Chris Williams' podcast. It's good. This time on the podcast, we're going to talk about another tricky situation that comes up particularly with software development teams, and that is instilling good development practices on the team. I'm not sure that instilling technical practices actually belongs on the plate of an Agile coach, but as a former developer myself, when I was an Agile coach for another company earlier in my career, I did find myself teaching technical techniques. The one we're going to talk about today is test-driven development. First, let me talk about test-driven development, and then I'll talk about why it's tricky for an Agile coach to teach. Test-driven development, or the way I prefer to refer to it as test-first development, is a practice in which, like the name I prefer suggests, you write your software unit tests before you write your implementation code. This does a couple of things for you. One, it forces you to think about the way that your objects that you're writing in your software interrelate. So for those of you who don't program, one paradigm of programming is called object-oriented programming, and that is where you are writing software behavior that centers around different objects. And those objects are model for real-world situations. So I might have a bank account object, and I might have some sort of automated teller interface. These two objects exist in analogy to the real world, where you may have a bank account with your bank, and there might be an automated teller machine that you use to interact with your bank account. If I'm using test-driven development or test-first development, I would think about the ways in which this automated teller needs to interact with my bank account, and I would start sketching what's known as an interface, the messages that go back and forth and the responses that you get when you send these messages. One message might be to retrieve your bank balance, for example. What can happen if you don't use test-first development is that an engineer will get interested in the implementation details of connecting the automated teller with the bank account, and when they go to write their tests afterward, because it's part of our definition of done that you need to have unit tests, they'll find that it can be tricky to set up these tests because the implementations assume some things about the way that this automated teller and this bank account are wired together. A real-world analogy of this would be, imagine a world in which instead of plugging in a lamp into a wall socket, you instead solder it together. The engineer who decided to solder the lamp into the wall socket wasn't thinking about one of the requirements, which is that I might want to move the lamp to a different location in the house, or I might want to use the wall socket for something besides lighting the room. The same happens with software. I might want to use this bank account in a different way than just interacting with the automated teller. For example, I might want to write some manual teller interface software so that my tellers in the bank can interact with the bank account. The automated teller might have some communication protocols that it uses that might be awkward for the manual teller. For example, When I put my card into an automated teller, I'm asked to authenticate using a personal identification number. If that information is baked into the bank account object, for the manual teller to be able to work with your account, they might have to ask you what your PIN number is. Obviously, I don't want to give my teller my PIN number verbally because then anybody in the bank who overhears me could use that information to get into my account, so it creates an awkward situation. It also turns out not only is this thinking about the design and the interactions with objects useful because you end up with a simpler, cleaner design than typically if you do it out of whole cloth without trying to implement it, but it's also quicker to write the tests and the code together than it is to write them separately. An experienced test-driven developer can often outperform a developer who uses test-after development practices where they write their code and then write their tests, because the test-after developer is often having to retrofit their implementation so that they can test their code. The test-driven developer, the one who's writing their tests first, discovers that before the implementation's been written when it's much easier to make changes. So that is test-driven development in a nutshell. Why is this a tricky thing for Agile coaches to teach? One is there's no guarantee that the Agile coach is up to speed with the software project in question. In a situation like my job, where our Scrum Masters are members of the team, they certainly understand the technology stack, but if I am a freelance Agile coach coming into a place, I might not have experience in the programming language that they're using. This is going to be a barrier to me teaching the team test-driven development. Another barrier, of course, is the fact that in my name, Agile Coach, I'm typically thought of as a process expert. I'm not thought of as a technical expert. So there can be some friction between these new ideas that I'm trying to introduce and the more experienced developers who have worked on a different way of developing software through their careers, and let's just say that they need some more persuasion in order to see the benefit. One way I like to tackle this as an Agile coach is if the team has something like innovation time, use that situation in order to introduce a new practice. Oftentimes, innovation time is around new technologies, but it can also be about new ways of development, and TDD is an excellent example there. Another possible entry point into TDD would be if you're doing a new feature or you're writing a new section of code that doesn't exist already. That's a good time to introduce test-driven development. A third way might be if you happen to have a developer on the team who already does test-driven development well, you can get into another practice called pair programming. That deserves an episode in itself, so I'm going to end this one here on test-driven development, and we'll talk to you next time. Until then, happy Agile practice. It's time to pack up the Agile Chuck Wagon for now. The Agile Chuck Wagon podcast is written, directed, and produced by Chuck Durfee. Chuck is a software development manager and Agile coach in the Denver area. Thanks to Audionautics.com and freesound.org for the backing music and sound effects. You can reach this podcast on Twitter at AgileChuckWagon or by email at chuck@agilechuckwagon.com for comments and episode suggestions. Please also visit our Patreon page to support this podcast and learn about membership benefits. Thank you very much for listening.